She was an elderly black woman eating alone, and when a server threw her food in the trash as a joke, nobody said a word. Not the manager, not the other staff, not a single customer. The server laughed, posted about it, and went back to work. What none of them knew was who that quiet old woman actually was, and what a single phone call from a bench outside was already setting in motion. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The dinner rush at Carver's Grill had a particular rhythm to it, the kind that felt almost choreographed if you stood still long enough to watch. Waitstaff moved between tables like currents in a narrow river, trays balanced on fingertips, voices kept just low enough to suggest professionalism without actually practicing it. The restaurant occupied a corner spot on Millbrook Avenue, the kind of place that charged $17 for a pasta dish and called itself upscale because of the pendant lighting and the laminated menus. On a Friday evening, every table along the main floor was occupied. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed too loudly at the bar. A child at table 6 pressed her palm flat against the window and watched the street. Nobody was watching the back corner booth near the service hallway. That was where Miss Evelyn Carter sat alone. She had come in quietly, the way she did everything, without announcement, without ceremony. She was a woman in her late 70s, small-framed, but not frail, her silver hair pinned back neatly beneath a dark blue headscarf. Her hands rested on the table in front of her, slightly trembling the way hands do at that age, not from fear or illness, but simply from the accumulated weight of years. She wore a modest dress, pressed and clean. Her shoes were sensible. She had placed her purse, old brown leather, worn soft at the corners, the strap repaired once with careful stitching, on the seat beside her, and she had folded her hands and waited with the patience of someone who had learned a long time ago that patience was the only currency that never lost its value. She had ordered the roasted chicken, according to the ticket, a glass of water, nothing extravagant. The plate had arrived. It had sat in front of her for no more than 2 minutes. And then Lauren Hayes picked it up. Lauren was 28 years old, with the kind of sharp features and practiced confidence that some people mistake for capability. She had been working at Carver's Grill for just under 3 years, long enough to know every shortcut and long enough to stop caring about the one she took. She had a way of moving through the restaurant that communicated, without words, that she found most of it beneath her. She smiled when the tips were good. She didn't smile as much when they weren't. She lifted Evelyn's plate from the table with one hand, smooth, casual, like she was clearing a finished dish. And, as she turned toward the service station near the kitchen entrance, she tipped it sideways over the open trash can beside the pass-through window and let it fall. The chicken, the roasted vegetables, the small garnish of parsley, all of it landed with a dull, wet sound at the bottom of the bin. Then she laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It wasn't even a loud one. It was the kind of laugh that comes from someone who is entirely comfortable with what they've just done. She looked like she wasn't even tasting it, Lauren said to the 2 co-workers standing closest to the service station, just staring at the wall like she forgot what food was for. One of the servers, a young woman named Dana, gave a short, uncomfortable sound that could have been a laugh or could have been something else entirely. The other, a heavy-set man named Troy, looked at the trash can, then at Lauren, and said nothing. He turned back to the counter and busied himself with a stack of napkins. At the table, Evelyn had not moved. She had watched it happen. She had seen Lauren pick up the plate, seen the arc of her arm, heard the sound. She did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She lowered her gaze slowly, the way someone does when they have made the deliberate choice not to let what just happened become something that lives on their face. Across the restaurant, people had noticed. The couple at table 9 had both turned their heads at the same moment, drawn by some instinct. A man near the window had paused mid-sentence. A woman with reading glasses on the end of her nose had looked up from her phone. Nobody moved. Andre Washington was 19 years old and had been bussing tables at Carver's Grill for 7 months. He was saving for his first semester of community college. His mother worked double shifts at a distribution warehouse outside the city, and on the nights she worked late, he was the one who made sure his younger sister got dinner. He was a quiet kid, not shy, exactly, but careful. He thought before he spoke. He had learned that keeping his head down was often the only way to keep a job like this one. But he had seen what Lauren did. He stood near the hostess stand with a plastic tub in his hands, and he watched Evelyn sitting alone in the corner booth, her hands still folded on the table, her gaze turned slightly downward. Something moved through him. Not anger exactly, but something close to it, complicated by the fact that he knew the cost of making it everyone's problem. The couple at table 4, a man in a collared shirt and a woman in a blazer, middle-aged, the kind of people who had strong opinions about wine pairings, leaned toward each other. "Did you see that?" the woman whispered. "Just leave it," the man said quietly. He reached for his glass. Carl Benson had managed Carver's Grill for 11 years. He was in his mid-50s, thick through the shoulders, with the easy authority of a man who had never particularly been challenged. He emerged from the back office near the bar, summoned by something he'd heard secondhand from Dana, and walked to the service station with the measured pace of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. He looked at Lauren. He looked at the trash can. He looked at the corner booth where Evelyn sat. "What happened?" he asked. Lauren explained it the way she had laughed, without particular concern. "I thought she was done. She wasn't eating it." Carl looked at Evelyn again. He held the look for a moment, assessing. Then he said, "Let's just keep things moving. We've got a full house tonight." He said it quietly, not wanting it to carry to the other tables. He said it the way managers say things when they want a problem to stop existing without actually solving it. He touched Lauren briefly on the shoulder. Not reproachfully, the way you touch someone who had made an honest mistake, but the way you touch someone you're standing beside. Then he walked away. Lauren straightened her apron. Andre set his tub down on the nearest empty surface and walked to the corner booth. He was careful about how he approached. Not rushing, not making a scene, just moving toward the table the way a busboy does when he's clearing or checking on something. He stopped beside Evelyn's booth and looked at her directly. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm really sorry about that. That wasn't right." Evelyn looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and steady and full of something he couldn't name. Not sadness, not bitterness. Something older and calmer than either. "What's your name?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, with a measured quality to it, the kind of voice that came from years of knowing exactly what it wanted to say. "André." She nodded slowly. "André." She said his name like she was filing it somewhere. "Thank you for coming over. I can get you a new plate. I can put the order in myself if—" "You don't need to do that," she said. She paused. "Could I have some water, please?" He nodded and got it for her immediately, setting the glass down with both hands. She thanked him the way you thank someone who has done something that genuinely cost them something, even if it didn't. It was a specific kind of thank you, warm and considered, and it landed differently than a reflex. Andre stood there for a moment longer than he needed to, and then he picked up his tub and walked back toward the service station. Lauren was still at the pass-through window. She was on her phone. She had taken a photo at some point. Andre didn't know exactly when, but from the angle she'd been holding the phone, he had a guess. She was typing something, thumbs moving quickly, and she was smiling at the screen the way people smile when they think they've said something clever. "Just another sad story," she said to no one in particular as she tucked the phone back in her apron pocket. "You see people like that everywhere. Nobody's life is your responsibility." Dana was pretending to read the specials board. Troy was still folding napkins. Evelyn sat quietly in the corner booth. She reached into her purse, the old leather one, soft and worn, and set on the table in front of her. As she shifted items inside it, looking for something, the flap fell open for just a moment. Long enough for the low pendant light above the booth to catch the edge of something metal inside. A medallion, circular, attached to a short length of ribbon. Dark metal with a raised design on its face. The shape of it suggested insignia. Military, perhaps. The lines too precise and deliberate to be decorative. Then Evelyn's hand found what she was looking for, a small notepad, and she closed the purse again, and the medallion was gone. She wrote nothing on the notepad. She set it back inside the purse. After several minutes, she stood carefully, steadied herself with one hand briefly on the table's edge, and made her way out through the front door. Andre watched her go from across the restaurant. He thought about following her, just to check she was all right. He thought about the cost of doing that during a dinner rush on a Friday night. He stood still, outside on the narrow sidewalk that ran along Millbrook Avenue. Evelyn sat down on a wooden bench positioned 2 storefronts down from the restaurant's entrance. She sat with her purse in her lap and her back straight and her hands folded, and she looked out at the street. After a moment, she reached into the purse and took out a phone, an older model, plain and practical. She dialed a number that she clearly did not need to look up. It rang twice. "It's Evelyn," she said when the line connected. Her voice was the same, quiet, certain, unhurried. She listened briefly. "I think it's time," she said. She waited for a response, then said only, "Yes," and ended the call. She sat back on the bench and folded her hands again. The street was ordinary around her, cars drifting past, a group of young people laughing outside a restaurant 3 doors down, the city doing what cities do on a Friday night. She watched it all without particular expression. Then, from the far end of Millbrook Avenue, a black SUV turned the corner. It moved at a steady pace, unhurried, and pulled to the curb at the far end of the block. Its windows were dark. Its engine idled almost silently. It did not park. It simply stopped, the way something stops when it is waiting. Inside Carver's Grill, Lauren Hayes had already moved on to her next table. She was smiling now, a real customer with a real tip on the line, and she moved through the dining room with the fluid ease of someone who had not given the corner booth a second thought. The restaurant hummed along. Glasses clinked. Silverware scraped porcelain. Someone's phone rang and was quickly silenced. Outside, the black SUV sat at the end of the block, engine running. And Evelyn Carter sat on the bench with her hands folded and watched the street with the calm patience of someone who had been many things in her life, none of which the people inside that restaurant would have guessed. The dinner rush thinned slowly, the way it always did on a Friday. Not all at once, but in stages, tables clearing by ones and twos until the noise level dropped from a roar to a murmur and the staff began to feel the night beginning to settle. Andre moved through his closing routines mechanically, wiping down surfaces, stacking chairs at the empty two-tops, carrying tubs of used glassware back to the dish station. His hands were busy. His mind was not. He had been running the same few seconds through his head on a loop since it happened. The sound of the plate hitting the trash can, the particular ease of Lauren's laugh, the way Evelyn had looked at him across that booth. Not with accusation, not with helplessness, with something steady and knowing that he was still trying to figure out how to hold. He paused near the service hallway and glanced toward the camera positioned in the upper corner of the back wall. It was one of 4 CCTV cameras in the main dining area. He knew exactly where all of them were because one of his first-week jobs had been to help the tech guy run a test on the system while Carl was out. The cameras fed to a local drive in the office, and footage was kept on a rolling 48-hour cycle before it was overwritten. That was something Carl had mentioned once in passing, probably not thinking anyone was particularly listening. Andre had been listening. He thought about what was on that footage right now. The angle from the back wall camera caught the service station, the pass-through window, and the first 3 booths along the sidewall, including, if he had the geometry right, the corner booth. He thought about the timestamp. He thought about the 48-hour window. He also thought about his rent, his mother's schedule, his sister's school supplies that needed replacing before next semester. He thought about what Carl would say if he found out, and what Lauren would say, and what saying nothing would cost him compared to what saying something would. He stood there in the service hallway with his hands damp and his jaw tight and his heart going faster than it should have been for a guy just finishing a Friday shift. Then he thought about the way Evelyn had said his name, the specific weight of it, deliberate and warm, like she was keeping it somewhere safe. He thought about what it meant that a woman who had just been publicly humiliated was the calmest person in the building. He made a decision. Andre had access to the office on certain nights, specifically the nights when Carl left early and left him to lock the back. This had become a quiet habit over the past 2 months, something Carl did without fanfare and Andre accepted without comment, because it meant a key and a small extra responsibility, and Carl trusted the process, even if he didn't particularly think about who was holding it. Tonight, Carl had already gone. He'd said goodnight to Lauren and Troy at the bar and headed for the parking lot at 9:15, leaving Andre to handle the close. The office was small and overheated, cluttered with invoices and a broken chair and a computer that ran slowly enough to be genuinely frustrating. The CCTV system operated through a secondary monitor on the left side of the desk, an older interface, not particularly sophisticated. Andre had watched the tech run through it during that first week test, and he had a reasonable memory for systems. He sat down at the desk. His hands were shaking a little, which annoyed him. It took him 12 minutes to locate the correct footage window, export a short clip to the USB drive he carried in his pocket, the one with his school application essays on it, and get back out into the hallway with the evidence that Lauren Hayes had done what she'd done and that Carl Benson had looked directly at an elderly woman sitting alone after her food had been thrown in the trash and told his staff to keep things moving. He stood in the hallway outside the office door with a USB drive in his closed fist and breathed. He didn't know what he was going to do with it yet. He just knew he needed it to exist somewhere other than a rolling 48-hour window that would erase itself by Sunday morning. Lauren Hayes lived in a one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a building that smelled permanently of someone else's cooking. She had lived there for 2 years and still hadn't put anything on the walls except a mirror by the door and a takeout menu from a place that had since closed. The apartment cost more than she could comfortably afford on a server's wage, which was a calculation she made every month and solved by telling herself it was temporary. Everything about her current life was temporary, according to Lauren. The job, the apartment, the particular version of herself that clocked in at Carver's Grill and smiled at customers and carried plates from kitchen to table 4 nights a week. It was all a holding pattern, a pause before the life she was actually supposed to be living caught up with her. She sat on her couch with her feet tucked under her and her phone propped against a throw pillow, going through the responses to the post she'd put up an hour ago. It hadn't been the full video. She wasn't stupid enough for that. Just a blurred clip, barely 3 seconds, enough to suggest what had happened without making herself the obvious subject of it. The caption had been deliberately vague. Some shifts just hit different LOL. The early comments were mostly laughing emojis and people who knew her from high school asking what had happened. But it was getting traction. That much was clear. She scrolled and told herself it was nothing. It was a blurred clip from inside a restaurant. Nobody could identify anything from 3 seconds of compressed footage. She was being careful. She had not, she told herself, done anything that wasn't done in restaurants every day. Food got thrown away. People misread situations. Timing was everything in a dinner rush. She had misjudged the timing. If the woman had wanted to keep eating, she would have said something. Lauren had been 23 when she graduated from a state school with a communications degree and a reasonable GPA and the very firm expectation that things would begin to move in a favorable direction shortly thereafter. That had been 5 years ago. In those 5 years, things had not moved particularly favorably. She had applied for 32 jobs in her field. She had gotten 4 interviews. She had been offered one position at a marketing firm downtown, which she had taken eagerly and held for 14 months before the company folded in a restructuring that affected, as far as Lauren could tell, exclusively the people who had been hired most recently. She had been waiting tables since then. First at a diner near the highway, then at a sports bar, then, elevated slightly, at Carver's Grill. She was not a cruel person, she told herself. She was a tired one. There was a difference, even if the difference wasn't always visible from the outside. She put her phone face down on the couch cushion and stared at the wall. Then she picked it back up and checked the responses again. Carl Benson drove home with the radio on a sports channel and his mind already somewhere else. He had managed restaurants long enough to know that the life of an evening shift was measured in close calls. The complaint that got smoothed over, the reservation that doubled up, the server who said the wrong thing to the wrong table and needed to be quietly redirected. Most of it dissolved by morning. He had built a career on the conviction that friction, managed quickly and quietly, left no permanent mark. Tonight had been minor. An old woman, a misunderstanding, an overly casual server with poor timing. Nobody had made a formal complaint. The woman had left on her own. Carl had kept the dining room moving, which was his job. He did not think about the fact that she had not been offered a replacement meal. He did not think about the way Dana had looked at him when he'd told the staff to keep things smooth. He thought about the Saturday morning delivery schedule and whether the new produce order had been confirmed. He pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the quiet of the car. Something nagged at him. He couldn't quite locate it. He had seen something in that dining room tonight that registered as unfamiliar, and he could not now identify what it was. Something about the way the old woman had sat. Not slumped, not flustered, just still in a way that felt purposeful somehow, like she had been somewhere like that before. He dismissed it. He went inside. Evelyn Carter was still on the bench when the restaurant's lights dimmed through the front window. She had been sitting there for the better part of an hour, and in that time, 3 different people had passed her on the sidewalk. A man walking a dog had nodded to her. A teenage girl had asked if she was all right, and Evelyn had thanked her sincerely and said she was just getting some air, which was enough. A security guard who patrolled the block as part of a contract route, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s named Davis, according to his badge, had come around the corner, seen her on the bench, and stopped. He didn't stop the way someone stops to check on an elderly woman sitting alone at night. He stopped the way someone stops when they recognize a person. He stood for a moment, and something moved across his face. A recalibration, a brief adjustment, the expression of a man who has encountered someone outside of a context he was expecting. He straightened. "Evening, ma'am," he said. He said it with a specific quality of respect that was different from the professional courtesy he extended to other pedestrians on the block. It was the kind of deference people extend when the person in front of them has earned something they can't fully name. Evelyn looked at him. "Evening," she said simply. He nodded once, like a small salute, and continued his patrol. At the far end of the block, the black SUV was still there. It had not moved. Now a second one had joined it. They sat side by side at the end of Millbrook Avenue, engines running, windows dark, neither of them drawing attention from the passersby, who were too focused on their own Friday evenings to notice 2 parked vehicles doing nothing. But they were there, and they were patient, and they were waiting with the specific quality of patience that comes from training rather than temperament. Evelyn's phone rang. She answered on the second ring. She listened. She did not respond for several seconds. Then she said, quietly and clearly, "No, don't make a scene. Just come." She lowered the phone and looked out at the street again. The city continued its ordinary business around her. Somewhere down the block, a restaurant door opened and a burst of warm noise came with it before cutting off. A couple passed, arms linked, arguing pleasantly about something inconsequential. Evelyn tucked her phone back into the old leather purse and sat with her hands folded and her eyes calm and her posture carrying the particular quality of a person who has spent a long time knowing exactly who they are, regardless of who anyone else thought they were looking at. Inside Carver's Grill, Lauren Hayes was finishing her side work, wiping down the bar stools, already thinking about nothing in particular. The dining room was down to 2 tables. The music had shifted to something slower, the classic end-of-service signal. Dana was counting her tips at the service station. Troy had already left. Lauren pulled out her phone again and checked the post. It had more responses now. Someone had shared it. The blurred clip was still blurred, still 3 seconds, still nothing identifiable. But the caption had taken on a life of its own in the comments section, people projecting their own interpretations onto it, filling in the spaces with stories. She scrolled through them with a half smile. Then a comment near the top stopped her. It was from an account she didn't recognize, a plain username, no profile photo. It said only. That's not going to stay funny. She stared at it for a moment. Then she dismissed it, the way people dismiss things that make them briefly uncomfortable. She put the phone in her apron pocket and went back to wiping down the bar stools. Outside, the 2 black SUVs sat at the end of the block. And then, without announcement or fanfare, a third one turned slowly onto Millbrook Avenue. It pulled up behind the first 2 and stopped. No doors opened. No one got out. The street around them was ordinary and uninterested, and the 3 dark vehicles sat in a neat line at the far end of the block like a held breath, waiting for whatever came next. Inside the restaurant, nobody noticed. The last 2 tables settled their checks and left. Dana counted her tips, said good night, and headed out the back. The kitchen staff had been gone for 20 minutes. Lauren finished her side work, turned off her section lights, and pulled on her jacket. Andre was still in the back, holding a USB drive in his closed fist, standing in a service hallway, and thinking about what it meant to have seen something and not looked away. He was still thinking about it when he locked the back door and stepped out into the alley. And somewhere on the other side of that building, on the bench on Millbrook Avenue, Evelyn Carter was still sitting, still waiting, still patient in the way of someone who has learned that the world eventually catches up with what is true, as long as someone is willing to stay long enough to make sure it does. The three SUVs idled at the end of the street. Something, very quietly, was about to change. The morning after a Friday dinner rush at Carver's Grill typically belonged to the cleaning crew and the silence. Chairs still upturned on tables. The particular smell of a commercial kitchen at rest, grease and bleach, and the ghost of whatever had been on the specials board. Carl usually came in around 10 to review the night's receipts and whatever notes the closers had left him, and the rest of the staff filtered in slowly for the lunch setup. But this was not a typical Saturday morning. By 9:40, the restaurant had been unlocked by Dana, who opened on weekends, and by 9:50, she had turned on the lights in the coffee machine and propped the front door open to let the night air out, the usual opening routine. The dining room was empty. The street outside was quiet. She was halfway through refilling the salt shakers when the door swung wider than she had pushed it. Two men walked in. They were sharply dressed in the way that communicates something specific and deliberate. Dark suits, no ties, shoes with the kind of polish that suggested these were not their only pair. They were not young, not old, somewhere in the composed middle, the age of men who have been in enough rooms to know how to enter one. They moved without hurry, scanning the dining room in a way that had nothing to do with deciding where to sit. They looked at the service station. They looked at the camera in the upper corner of the back wall. They looked at the floor plan with the specific efficiency of people assessing a space, not admiring it. Dana held a salt shaker in each hand and said, "We're not open until 11. The taller of the two men looked at her and said, pleasantly but without particular warmth, "We're not here for breakfast. Is the manager in?" "He comes in at 10. "We'll wait," the man said, and they chose a table near the center of the room. Not a corner, not the bar. The center where they could see every entrance and be seen from every angle. They sat down with the ease of men who are never waiting, only positioning. Dana set down her salt shakers and sent Carl a text that said, "Two men here early. Suits, not customers." She spent the next several minutes pretending to be busy with the salt shakers and the sugar caddies and the stack of menus by the host stand, stealing glances at the two men every 30 seconds or so. They did not look at her. They did not look at their phones. They did not lean toward each other and talk. They simply sat with the complete stillness of people who have spent enough time waiting in serious places that a Saturday morning in a mid-range restaurant does not register as inconvenient. On the table between them was nothing. No briefcases, no folders, no visible indication of why they were here. That absence of props was, somehow, more unsettling to Dana than anything they could have been carrying. Andre arrived at 9:55 for the lunch setup. He came in through the back, still carrying yesterday's weight. The USB drive was in the front pocket of his jeans. He had not slept particularly well. He had lain in his bed and run through several versions of what happened next, none of which had felt clean or simple. He had thought about calling in today and dismissed the thought. He needed the shift. His family needed the shift. He pushed through the swinging kitchen door into the main dining room and stopped. He saw the two men immediately. Most people would have clocked them as customers who had come in early, maybe businessmen killing time before a late brunch. Andre looked at them and felt something different. He had grown up in a neighborhood where you developed early the skill of reading a room, of understanding, before you could articulate it, the weight a particular kind of presence carries. These two men were not customers. They were something else, and whatever that something was, it had brought them specifically here. The taller one turned and looked at Andre with the unhurried attention of someone who already knows more than they're showing. It was a brief look, a few seconds at most, and then, almost imperceptibly, the man gave a very small nod. Not a greeting exactly, something closer to acknowledgement, like he had been given a name and was now matching it to a face. Andre stood very still for a moment. Then he set down his tub, and when to start rolling silverware. Lauren arrived at 10:15. She came in through the front, sunglasses still on, coffee cup in hand, moving with the casual momentum of someone who had slept fine and considered the previous evening closed. She glanced at the two men at the center table, clocked them as early arrivals, and headed for the server station to clock in. "Who are they?" she murmured to Dana. "They asked for Carl," Dana said. "Whatever." Lauren pulled her apron from her locker and tied it on. She had checked her phone that morning, and the post was still up, still circulating in the small orbit of her social circle and a few shares beyond it. The blurred clip, the vague caption, nothing traceable. She was fine. The comments had grown overnight from a handful to over 200, which was more than she'd expected and less than she'd feared. Most of them were the usual, laughing reactions, a few people tagging friends, a woman she hadn't spoken to since high school leaving a string of lowercase affirmations. There was one from a page she didn't recognize with a lot of followers and a profile that described itself as a community accountability channel. It had been shared from there. She had looked at the share count, 43, and decided 43 was not a number worth worrying about. She looked at the two men again from across the room and rolled her eyes very slightly. Not enough for them to see, but enough for Dana to catch it. "Probably a catering inquiry," she said, and went to set up her section. Carl arrived at 10:03, having gotten Dana's text in his car. He walked in through the front door with the slightly accelerated pace of a manager who has been told something is off, but hasn't decided yet what category it belongs to. He saw the two men and slowed. Something moved across his face. Not recognition exactly. Something closer to the feeling of almost recognizing something, like a word. "I was here last night," Andre said. His voice was steady, which surprised him. "I saw what happened. I have footage." He set the USB drive on the table between the salt shaker and the folded napkin and kept his hand over it for just a moment before lifting it away. The man looked at the drive. He looked at Andre. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, something more like confirmation, the small internal adjustment of a person whose expectation has just been met. "Sit down for a moment," the man said. Andre sat down in the chair across from him, which he had never done at a customer table in 7 months of working there, and the man took the USB drive and placed it inside his jacket pocket and looked at Andre with a level, unhurried attention that made Andre feel, for the first time in this whole business, that he had done the right thing. "What's your name?" the man asked. "Andre of Washington." The man nodded. "Thank you, Andre." Across the restaurant, Lauren was laughing. She had her phone out again at the server station and was showing Dana something on the screen, the post, probably, or some response to it. And her laugh was the same easy, unbothered laugh from the night before. It carried across the half-empty dining room and landed in the silence around the center table like a stone dropped in still water. The suited man heard it. He did not look toward it immediately. He looked at the badge on the table in front of him, then put it back in his jacket. Then he looked toward the server station with an expression that was not angry. There was no heat in it, but had a quality of quiet, settled decision that was somehow more serious than anger. He turned to his colleague and said 4 words. "Call the others in." Outside on Millbrook Avenue, a door opened. Then another. The first thing people on Millbrook Avenue noticed was not the number of vehicles, though there were several now, a line of them along the curb that had not been there an hour before. The first thing they noticed was the stillness of it. There was no rush, no urgency, no lights or noise. Just dark vehicles pulling into position with the measured precision of a well-rehearsed sequence, and then doors opening, and then figures stepping out. They were in uniform. Not all of them. Some wore the dark suits from before, but enough of them wore pressed military attire with the insignia of rank visible at the collar and the shoulder to make it unmistakable. High-ranking, composed, the kind of people for whom a public street is not a stage, but simply another environment to move through with complete authority and no theatrics. The vehicles had parked in a way that was not accidental, spaced evenly, angled slightly toward the curb, leaving the sidewalk in front of Carver's grill clear and accessible, the way you leave a path clear when you intend to use it. There were 5 vehicles in total now, which was enough to constitute a presence even on a Saturday morning street that had its share of traffic. A delivery driver who had double-parked 2 doors down to drop off a weekend order came out of the building, looked at the line of dark SUVs, and got back in his truck without touching his hand truck. Pedestrians slowed. A woman with a stroller stopped entirely and watched from the opposite sidewalk. A man coming out of the dry cleaner 2 doors down stood on the step with his plastic-wrapped shirts over one arm, watching. A teenager on a bicycle pulled to the curb and took out a phone. The officers and the suited figures moved toward the front entrance of Carver's Grill in a loose formation. Not aggressive, not rushed. Purposeful. Inside the restaurant, Dana saw them through the front window first. She had been wiping down the bar, and she looked up at the movement on the sidewalk and stood with her cloth in her hand, watching the procession approach the door. "Carl," she said. Carl was still at the bar counter. He turned and looked at the window, and the coffee mug in his hand stopped halfway to his mouth. Lauren was looking at her phone and did not look up. The door opened. The first man through was one of the uniformed officers, a woman in her 50s, silver-haired, with a row of decorations on her breast, and the easy command of someone who has walked into rooms that required far more from her than this one. She held the door for the 2 men who had arrived earlier, and then 4 more figures followed, and then the room had changed. Not dramatically, not with noise, but the weight of the space shifted immediately and completely, the way a room changes when the people in it are no longer the most significant thing happening. Customers who had filtered in for early coffee sat very still. Dana set down her cloth. Carl set down his mug. Andre, from his position near the service station, watched the door and felt something in his chest that was not quite relief and not quite fear, but something that sat between the two and waited. Lauren looked up from her phone. She saw the uniforms and the suits and the number of people who had just entered, and she held her phone loosely at her side and blinked at them the way you blink when your brain is running a quick inventory of possible explanations and not finding any that are comfortable. The silver-haired officer, whose name, stitched above her breast pocket, was Colonel Reed, looked around the room with the unhurried assessment that seemed to be a shared quality among everyone who had arrived this morning. She nodded once to the man who had been sitting at the center table. He stood. Then a second man, older, broad through the chest, with the kind of face that has spent decades giving information without reacting to it, walked directly toward Carl Benson. Carl straightened instinctively. The man stopped in front of him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Mr. Benson," he said, "we need to speak about how you treated Ms. Evelyn Carter last evening." The name sat in the air of the restaurant. Carl's jaw tightened slightly. He was working through something, trying to locate what he was supposed to say, what version of last night could be offered up that would make this manageable. "There was a situation with a customer," he began carefully. "My staff handled it incorrectly, and I take full." "We'll get to that," the man said. Simply, without hostility. And somehow that was worse than hostility would have been, because it communicated that what Carl had just said was not wrong, but was also not close to sufficient, and they both knew it. Carl closed his mouth. Across the room, Lauren was still standing at the server station with her phone at her side. She had been watching the officer and the suited men, and now she was watching Carl, and she was doing the math in the slow, reluctant way of someone who does not want the answer they are arriving at. She had heard the name. Ms. Evelyn Carter, the old woman from last night, the one she had, the plate, the trash. She told herself there was a reasonable explanation for all of this. Some kind of mix-up, some other complaint from some other night that had nothing to do with her. She almost believed it. The man who had been sitting at the center table, the taller of the original two, spoke now to the room at large. Not loudly. He had the kind of voice that doesn't need volume. "We'd like everyone on staff this morning to remain present for the next few minutes," he said. "This won't take long if everyone cooperates." Dana looked at Andre. Andre looked at the door. The front door of Carver's Grill opened again, and Evelyn Carter walked in. She came in alone, without ceremony, without anyone at her elbow. She wore the same clothes as the night before, or nearly the same, neatly pressed, her blue headscarf in place, her old leather purse on her arm. She moved slowly but without hesitation, the way she had moved throughout the previous evening, with the settled deliberateness of someone who is exactly where they intended to be. She paused for just a moment inside the doorway and took in the room. The seated customers, the staff lined up near the bar, the officers, Carl with his hands on the counter, and his face carrying the specific expression of a man who has realized, too late, that a situation he dismissed was not, in fact, dismissible. She took all of it in the way she seemed to take most things, calmly, completely, without letting it show on her face as anything other than attention. She did not look at the officers first. She did not look at Carl. She did not look at Lauren. She looked at Andre. He was standing near the service station with his hands at his sides, and when she found him across the room, something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, but visibly. A small, specific warmth, like a light that had been on low turning up just a degree. She nodded at him once, the same kind of nod the man had given him earlier, recognition, acknowledgement, something that meant more than its physical scale suggested. Andre nodded back. He felt something release in his chest that had been tight since 9:15 the previous evening. Evelyn turned her attention to the room. She looked at Carl for a moment, not with anger, not with the satisfaction of someone arriving to deliver punishment. She looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student who has failed a test they were entirely capable of passing. There was disappointment there, but not the wounded kind. The kind that comes from experience, from having seen, too many times, what happens when people with small authority use it to make themselves feel larger. Then she looked at Lauren. Lauren's face had gone through several changes in the past 90 seconds. The easy confidence from the morning had drained steadily, replaced first by confusion, then by the particular pallor of someone realizing a situation is not what they assumed. She was gripping her phone now with both hands without appearing to notice she was doing it. She was looking at Evelyn with an expression that wanted to be dismissive, that was reaching for dismissive the way a drowning person reaches for anything floating and finding nothing to hold. Lauren had spent her whole morning telling herself she knew the shape of this day. She had woken up in her apartment with its bare walls and her circulating post and the comfortable logic that nothing serious had happened. A plate of food, a woman who hadn't complained, a manager who had handled it. That was all. The shape of it had just changed entirely, and the woman standing in that doorway was the reason why. Ms. Carter. It was Colonel Reed who spoke from near the door. She spoke with the clean precision of someone addressing a briefing room. "We're ready when you are." Evelyn looked at the colonel and gave a small nod. Then she looked back at the room, at the customers sitting quietly over their coffee cups, at Dana frozen behind the bar, at Carl with his jaw set and his hands gripping the counter's edge, at Lauren standing with her phone and her fading confidence. "Sit down, everyone," Evelyn said. Her voice was not loud. It carried anyway, the way voices do when the room around them has gone entirely quiet. "Please." People sat, even the customers. Even Carl, after a moment's resistance, pulled out the nearest stool and sat. Lauren did not move immediately. She stood for another second, and something crossed her face, the last flicker of the reflex she'd been running all morning, the one that said this was manageable, explainable, survivable. Then that flicker went out. She sat down. One of the suited men produced a tablet and set it on the nearest table, screen facing the room. He angled it so the camera feed was visible, clear, time-stamped, multiple angle from the CCTV system. The footage that Andre had copied was already loaded. But this was not a copy from a USB drive. This was a full pull from the restaurant's own system, accessed by people who did not need anyone's permission to retrieve it. The frame was paused on the moment Lauren's arm tilted over the trash can. The plate mid-fall, the timestamp in the corner. Her face entirely visible, entirely clear. Lauren looked at it. She looked at her own face on that screen, caught in the specific moment of doing the thing she had told herself was minor, was nothing, was just a misread situation in a busy dinner service. She looked at it, and something in her went very still. The man with the tablet looked at Carl. "We'd also like to look at the audio from your interaction immediately following," he said. "We have that as well." Carl said nothing. His face had the particular blankness of a man who has just understood that the structure he has been standing on has been hollow for some time, and that the ground beneath it is now very far down. Outside on Millbrook Avenue, the line of vehicles sat quietly along the curb. More people had gathered on the opposite sidewalk, watching through the restaurant's front windows. Someone had started filming on their phone. Several people had. The image of a restaurant full of seated people and a row of dark official vehicles parked outside was already in motion, already traveling, pixel by pixel, outward from this corner of the city. Inside, Evelyn sat at a table near the center of the room. Not the corner booth from last night. The center. She sat with her purse on the table in front of her and her hands folded on top of it, and she looked at the paused image on the tablet screen for a long moment without expression. Then she looked up at the room. "I didn't come here for power," she said. The quietness of her voice made the room feel smaller, more contained. "I came here for peace. I come here for peace most Friday evenings. I've been doing that at one table or another in this city for a long time." She paused. "But now we'll do this properly." Lauren opened her mouth. The sound that came out was not quite a word. It was the beginning of an apology or an explanation or some combination of both. The kind of thing people reach for when they sense that the moment for it may already have passed. Evelyn looked at her. "Not yet," she said. Simply, without cruelty. Lauren closed her mouth. The man with the tablet pressed play, and the room watched. The footage was 47 seconds long, start to finish. It showed everything. The plate, the tilt, the sound that the microphone on the CCTV system had picked up with surprising clarity. Not just the sound of the food hitting the trash, but Lauren's laugh afterward, and her voice, and the words she had used. It showed Carl arriving at the service station. It showed him looking at the corner booth. It showed the moment he turned away. Nobody in the room spoke during those 47 seconds. When it ended, the tablet screen went dark. The silence lasted longer than anyone was comfortable with. Evelyn was the one who broke it. She looked at the senior officer beside Colonel Reed, a man with 2 more decades of rank visible than anyone else in the room, who had stood near the door since arriving without speaking a word. The way people stand when their presence alone is the message. She said, "Let's review everything. Properly." She said it the way someone says something that has already been decided. Not a request, not a command. Just the next step in a sequence that she had known was coming and had come here to see through and was now ready to begin. Outside, a news van had turned onto Millbrook Avenue. The teenager on the bicycle was still filming. And somewhere in the growing crowd on the opposite sidewalk, a woman held up her phone and said to the person beside her, in a voice full of something she could not name, but felt entirely, "I don't know what's happening in there, but I don't think it's going to be the same when it's done." She was right about that. She was entirely right. The tablet screen had gone dark, and the room was still holding the silence that followed the footage like a held breath. Nobody had moved. The customers at their coffee cups had not moved. Dana had not moved. Carl sat on his bar stool with his hands flat on the counter in front of him as though he needed something solid to press against. Lauren sat nearest the server station with her phone face down on the table and her eyes fixed at a point just past the edge of it, at nothing. The silence had a texture to it. Not the comfortable silence of a room between conversations, but the weighted silence of a room waiting for someone to say the thing that has been building since before anyone fully understood what was building. The pendant lights above the tables hummed very faintly. Somewhere in the kitchen, a refrigeration unit clicked on and off. Outside, muffled by the glass, the street continued its ordinary Saturday business, indifferent to everything happening on the other side of the window. Evelyn stood at the center of the room. She had not sat down yet. She stood with her purse on her arm and her hands folded over it, and she looked at the room the way someone looks at a place they have been before in a different life. Not with nostalgia exactly, but with the particular attention of a person who notices what has changed and what hasn't. The senior officer who had stood near the door without speaking since the convoy arrived, the man with 2 more decades of rank on his chest than anyone else present, took 2 steps forward from the wall. He was broad through the chest and moved with the measured economy of someone who had spent decades in rooms where economy of motion was a professional requirement. He stopped to Evelyn's left, slightly behind her, in the position of someone who is not beside a person, but behind them, supporting. He looked at the room. "Ms. Evelyn Carter," he said. His voice was the kind that fills space without effort, the voice of a man who has addressed auditoriums and situation rooms and never needed a microphone. former director of strategic intelligence operations. The words landed in the silence and rearranged it. Dana made a sound, small and involuntary, the sound of a person whose brain has just recalibrated. A customer near the window sat back slowly in his chair. Carl's jaw worked once, like he was attempting to form a sentence and finding none available. The officer continued. He did not rush it. He said it the way official things are said when they are meant to be understood completely and not partially. Ms. Carter served for 31 years in active intelligence and strategic operations. She directed field operations across 4 continents. She is directly credited with the extraction and safe return of 47 military personnel from classified engagements, the details of which remain sealed. She trained many of the individuals currently in this room. He paused. She has received commendations that most of the people in this building do not have the clearance to read. Another pause, quieter this time. She came to this restaurant last night for dinner. He said that last sentence the way you say the punchline to a joke that isn't funny, flat and deliberate, so the weight of it could land without decoration. Lauren looked at Evelyn. She looked at her the way you look at a person when you're restructuring everything you thought you were looking at, when the image in front of you refuses to match the one you built in your head, and you're running the comparison over and over and still coming up wrong. The old woman with the trembling hands, the plate in the trash, the laugh. Her own laugh, sitting inside her now, like something she had swallowed wrong. Evelyn turned slightly and looked at the officer. "Thank you, James," she said, quietly, and with a familiarity that indicated these two people had known each other for a very long time. Then she turned back to the room and was still for a moment. "I'm not going to—" The room reacted to it the way rooms react to things they can feel the weight of without being able to name. The customers nearest the table leaned slightly forward without realizing it. Dana looked at it, then at the officers, and saw in the officers' faces the particular expression of people in the presence of something they have enormous respect for. Colonel Reed looked at it from across the room and stood slightly straighter. James looked at it with an expression that was not surprise, but something closer to respect reconfirmed. "This was given to me after an operation in 1987 that officially did not occur," Evelyn said. She did not say it with pride. She said it as information. "There are 9 of these in existence. 6 of the people who received them are no longer living." She picked it up and turned it once in her fingers, the way you turn something you have carried a long time without needing to look at it, and then set it back down. "I carry it every day, not because I need it, because it reminds me what the work was for. It reminds me of the people who didn't come home. It reminds me that dignity, the kind you extend to a stranger, the kind you hold on to when someone takes something from you, is not a small thing. It never was." She looked at Lauren then. A direct, unhurried look. Lauren had gone very quiet. She was not fidgeting. She was not reaching for her phone. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes on Evelyn, and the expression on her face was one that had no performance left in it. The look of someone who has run out of the versions of themselves they use for cover and is sitting, without those, in front of a truth that is uncomfortable and unavoidable. "Let's review everything," Evelyn said. She looked at the man with the tablet. All of it. The footage ran for the second time, and this time nobody in the room pretended not to watch. The CCTV pull was comprehensive. Every camera angle, every relevant window of time. From the moment Evelyn walked through the front door the previous evening to the moment Carl told his staff to keep things moving and turn back toward his office. 47 seconds of Lauren. Clear, unblurred. Her face, her arm, the plate, the trash can, the laugh. Then her voice, picked up by the overhead mic with startling clarity. She looked like she wasn't even tasting it. Then Carl, arriving at the service station, looking at the corner booth. The expression on his face, the expression of a man making a private decision in a public place. And then his words, just as clearly, "Let's just keep things moving. We've got a full house tonight." Then the camera angle covering the corner booth itself. Evelyn, sitting alone, not moving, hands folded, head lowered by degrees, slowly, quietly, in the particular way of a person choosing dignity over display. The room watched all of it. Dana watched it with her arms crossed and her jaw set, her expression carrying the specific quality of a woman who had suspected something was wrong the night before and had said nothing and was now sitting with the cost of that. The customers watched it with the discomfort of people who had not asked to be present for something important but found themselves here regardless. Witnesses to a moment they would carry home and describe to people who hadn't been in the room. Andre watched it and was glad, simply and completely, for the 12 minutes he had spent in that back office on a Friday night, when he could have just gone home. Lauren watched herself on screen and felt something she had no name for. Not shame exactly, though shame was part of it. Something bigger and more uncomfortable than shame, something that had to do with recognition. With the specific horror of watching yourself do something you cannot undo and understanding, for the first time, that you did it without a second thought. That there had been no hesitation. That the ease of it, the casual, unguarded ease of it, was the most honest thing the footage showed. When it ended, James set the tablet face down on the table. "I want to be clear about something," he said. And he said it to Carl specifically. "The footage speaks for itself. What I want to address is what happened after." He paused. A woman who gave 31 years of her life to the security of this country sat alone in your restaurant after her food was thrown in the trash. And the person responsible for the environment of this establishment told his staff to keep things moving. "That is what we're here about," Carl said. "I understand that what happened was. I'm not asking you to characterize it," James said, pleasantly, firmly. "I'm telling you what we observed." Carl closed his mouth. Lauren was looking at the table in front of her. She had been looking at it since the footage started. She had watched herself on that screen the way you watch something that feels both like you and entirely not like you. The specific dissociation of seeing your own worst moment played back with perfect clarity and no editing. The laugh was the worst part. Not the plate, not the words, the laugh. The ease of it, the complete absence of hesitation. She had looked at an elderly woman sitting alone and had felt nothing that resembled discomfort until right now, 24 hours later, watching it back in a room full of people who had flown in specifically to respond to it. "Why?" Colonel Reed asked. She said from across the room, simply, without preamble. She was looking at Lauren. Lauren looked up. "That's the question," Colonel Reed said. "Not the how, not the when, just why." Lauren had been assembling an answer for the past hour. She had versions of it. The stress of the shift, the pace of a Friday dinner rush, a misread situation she had handled poorly. All technically true, but incomplete in the way that lets you be accurate without being honest. She knew that. She had known it since the footage played, and she had watched herself laugh and understood that the real answer was simpler and worse. She had done it because it had not occurred to her not to. Because the woman in the corner booth had read to her as someone whose reaction did not matter. That was the thing she had no version of herself capable of defending. "I don't have a good answer," Lauren said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended, and she let it be small because it was the first thing she had said in 24 hours that she did not need to immediately walk back. "No," Colonel Reed said. "You don't." Outside on Millbrook Avenue, the crowd had grown. Not a mob. People standing on the opposite sidewalk, phones raised, watching something unfold without being certain what it is. The news van had parked and two people were out of it now, a camera operator and a woman in a blazer, filming the line of official vehicles with the practiced composure of someone who has covered enough unusual Saturdays to know that the story clarifies itself if you wait. Inside the restaurant, one of the suited men had stepped near the front window on a brief phone call. He spoke quietly, listened, and returned to the group. "The chain has been notified," he said to James. James nodded as though this was expected because it was. Carver's Grill was not independently owned. It was a franchise location under the regional umbrella of a hospitality group called Brentwood Dining Partners. Brentwood had investors. Those investors included two private equity firms whose portfolios also contained government-contracted catering and facility services, which created an uncomfortable proximity between the events of Friday evening and the offices of people who only took Saturday morning calls when something significant required it. The call had been taken. The conversation was brief because the footage was self-explanatory and a decision was needed, not a discussion. Lauren's post had not been blurred enough. Someone, Two people, independently, had identified the server station layout visible in the background and matched it to Carver's Grill on Millbrook Avenue within 4 hours of the post going up. That identification had spread through 3 community forums before midnight. By Saturday morning, it had reached a journalist who covered workplace accountability stories, and from there to the news van now parked outside. Lauren's name had not been published yet, but it was a matter of hours. One of the suited men placed a phone on the table in front of Lauren. On the screen was her original post, the blurred clip, the vague caption that had seemed so harmless 15 hours ago, and beneath it, the share count, which was no longer 43. It was not 43 by a margin that made Lauren's stomach drop when she saw it. She had understood, in an abstract way, that the post had spread. She had not understood, until this moment, how far or how fast. Social media forensics on incidents like this move faster than most people expect, the man said, without judgment. The restaurant has been identified. The post has been flagged by multiple reporting accounts. We expect your name to be associated publicly within the next several hours. Lauren sat with that. She looked at the number on the screen and thought about the 43 she had checked that morning with something approaching relief, and felt the distance between those two numbers like a physical thing. The gap between the version of this she had believed she was living and the version that was actually true. I want to be clear, Evelyn said, and her voice drew the room back to her effortlessly, the way it always did. I did not come here to destroy anyone's life. She looked at Lauren. That is not what this is. Lauren looked at her. The expression on her face was not defiance, not calculation. It was the raw, unguarded look of someone who has had every layer of protection stripped away and is sitting without it, exposed, in front of a woman she had treated as though she were invisible and who had turned out to be, in every measurable way, the most significant person in the room. Then what is it? Lauren asked. She was not being combative. She was genuinely asking, the way people ask when they have stopped performing and started actually needing to know. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. She studied her the way she had studied the room when she first walked in, completely, without hurry, without deciding the conclusion before finishing the examination. It's a mirror, Evelyn said. That's all. Just a mirror. She let the silence hold for a few seconds. Carl's phone buzzed on the counter beside him. He looked at the screen, a name from the corporate tier, a number saved since the day he was hired as regional manager, never expected on a Saturday morning. His face changed in the way of someone whose last piece of solid ground has just cracked. He said face down. You may want to take that, Mr. Benson, James said. Carl picked it up and walked toward the back hallway. The room was quiet while he was gone. Dana straightened a stack of menus that did not need straightening. Andre thought about his mother working double shifts and what it meant that he was standing here on this particular Saturday morning instead of somewhere else entirely. Carl came back. He sat on the bar stool. They've placed me on administrative leave effective today. Dana looked at the wall. Andre looked at his hands. Lauren looked at Carl and then back at the table. Pending review, Carl added, as though that softened it. Nobody responded to that. Evelyn turned and looked at Andre. Andre, who had been standing near the service station through all of it, through the footage and the corporate call and the brand being quietly dismantled at the level above Carl's pay grade, stood up straight when Evelyn looked at him. Not because he was told to, but because something in her attention required it. This young man, Evelyn said, and she said it to the room, clearly and without qualification, saw something wrong. He was 19 years old, working a job his family depends on, with every practical reason to keep his head down. He did not keep his head down. She paused. He secured evidence at personal risk. He came forward to people he had never met, with no guarantee of how it would be received. He acted because it was right, not because it was safe, not because it was easy, but because it was right. She looked at him directly. That matters. It will continue to matter. Andre felt heat behind his eyes that he was not prepared for and did not entirely manage. He nodded once, quickly, and looked at the wall, and then back at Evelyn because looking away felt wrong. Dana started clapping. Quiet at first, a few slow strikes of her palms, and then Colonel Reed joined her, and then the other officers, and then the customers at their tables, awkward and genuine, the specific applause of people who are not entirely sure of the protocol, but are sure enough of the feeling to act on it. Carr did not clap. He sat on his bar stool and looked at the counter, and that absence was its own kind of statement. Lauren looked at her hands. Evelyn waited for the room to settle. "This isn't about punishment," she said then. She said it the way you say something true that you know will be tested by what comes next. "It's about correction." She held the word for a moment. "There's a difference. Punishment is the end. Correction is the beginning." She picked up the medallion from the table and placed it back in her purse, closing the flap with a quiet click of the worn brass fastener. "We have some things to discuss," she said, "about what this restaurant is going to become." She looked at James, and James nodded, and the room began, slowly, to shift from something it had been into something it was not yet, but was being given the chance to try. Outside, the news van sat with its camera rolling. The woman in the blazer was still talking, and the people on the sidewalk were still watching, and Millbrook Avenue on a Saturday morning had become, without anyone fully planning it, the place where something true had refused to stay quiet, which is, in the end, the only way true things ever manage to last. The news van was gone by late afternoon. The crowd on the sidewalk had thinned by noon and disappeared by 2, the way crowds do when the visible part of the story stops moving and the real part retreats indoors. The official vehicles left in a quiet procession until Millbrook Avenue looked the way it always looked on a Saturday. Ordinary, unhurried, indifferent to what had happened on that particular stretch of curb a few hours earlier. But the restaurant did not reopen that day. Lauren sat alone in the dining room after everyone else had gone. She had not been asked to leave, and no one had told her she could stay, and so she had simply remained in her chair near the server station while the suited men filed out and the officers followed and the customers drifted back to their Saturday. She sat there until the room was empty and the only sounds were the refrigeration unit in the kitchen and the distant noise of the street, and then she sat there some more. She was not thinking about her job or the share count or the hours until her name went public. She was thinking about the footage, not the part with the plate. The part that came after, the 47 seconds of Evelyn sitting alone in the corner booth, lowering her head by degrees, choosing not to react, choosing dignity deliberately in a moment when the person who had just humiliated her was 3 feet away laughing. Lauren had watched that and thought, I have never once in my life been that composed. She thought about that for a long time. She was still thinking about it when she heard the back door open and close, and then footsteps, and then Evelyn walk into the dining room from the service hallway. Alone this time, no officers, no suited men, and stopped when she saw Lauren still sitting there. They looked at each other across the empty restaurant. I thought everyone had gone, Evelyn said. I didn't know where to go, Lauren said. It came out more honest than she intended, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had said in a very long time. Evelyn considered her for a moment. Then she pulled out the chair across the table and sat down. Lauren looked at her hands. I'm not going to say it was the job or the shift or that I was having a bad month. I know it wasn't that. What was it then? Evelyn asked. She asked it the way she had asked most things, without pressure, without the particular edge that makes a question feel like a trap. Lauren was quiet for a while. The refrigeration unit clicked. A car passed outside. I've been angry for a long time, she said finally. Not at anyone specific, just at the gap between where I thought I'd be and where I am. And I took that gap and I put it somewhere it didn't belong. She stopped. Then, that doesn't explain it. I know it doesn't explain it. I needed you to know that it wasn't nothing to me. That I'm not someone who does that and feels nothing. Evelyn listened to all of it. She did not rush to respond, and she did not offer the quick absolution that Lauren was not asking for anyway. I know you feel something, Evelyn said at last. That's why you're still sitting here. She looked at Lauren with the same level, unhurried attention she gave everything. Not warm, not cold. Present. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it clearly, Evelyn said. What you did was wrong. Not careless, not thoughtless. Wrong. And the fact that your life has been difficult does not change that. A lot of people have difficult lives. Most of them manage not to throw an old woman's food in the trash. Lauren nodded. It was a small, careful nod, the nod of someone accepting something they cannot argue with and are not trying to. But, Evelyn said, and she let the words sit a moment before continuing. Wrong is not the same as permanent. Not for everyone. Some people it is. Some people I have looked at and known. There is nothing behind the behavior but the behavior itself. She paused. That is not what I see when I look at you. Lauren looked up. What I see, Evelyn said, is someone who has been looking in entirely the wrong direction for entirely too long. She folded her hands on the table. Your anger isn't the problem. Your direction is. The room was quiet. Then Evelyn said, simply and without ceremony, I have some plans for this building. They're going to require staff. People willing to work differently than they've worked before. Not just serving tables, but serving a purpose. She held Lauren's gaze. You can walk away from this. Take whatever consequences come publicly and start somewhere else. That is a legitimate choice, and I will not think less of you for it. She paused. Or you can stay. Work under a structure that will be demanding and accountable and will not allow what happened Friday night to happen again. Rebuild something here, including yourself. Slowly, without shortcuts. She let the choice land. There is no sympathy in the offer, Evelyn added, quiet and clear. Just a chance? Those aren't the same thing. Lauren sat with it. Outside, a late afternoon bus went by on Millbrook Avenue, the hydraulic exhale of its doors carrying faintly through the glass. She thought about her apartment with its bare walls. She thought about the gap, the one she had been angry at for 5 years. And she thought about Evelyn calling it a direction problem instead of a destiny problem, and something in that small reframing shifted something in her chest that she could not immediately name. I want to stay, she said quietly, and do it right this time. Evelyn studied her, not with warmth yet. Warmth was something that would have to be earned across time, not granted in a conversation, but without dismissal. All right, she said. She stood, picked up her purse, and walked toward the front of the restaurant. At the door, she paused and looked back at Lauren. Monday morning, she said. 8 o'clock. Be here. She left. The door closed behind her with its particular sound, solid, quiet, final, and Lauren sat alone in the empty restaurant and breathed. Andre had been home for 2 hours when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He was sitting on the edge of his bed with his shoes still on, too tired to remove them, thinking about the day in the fragmented way of someone whose brain is still catching up. He answered on the 4th ring. Andre. He recognized the voice immediately. It's Evelyn Carter. He sat up straight. Yes, ma'am. I'll be brief, she said. I want to talk to you about your plans. Will you come to the restaurant Tuesday morning? Yes, he said. Then, can I ask what it's about? Your future, she said simply. Get some sleep, Andre. She ended the call. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the opposite wall. Then he reached over and finally took off his shoes, and something about that small, ordinary action in the middle of an entirely extraordinary day made him laugh. A short, surprised sound, alone in his room. The kind of laugh that comes not because something is funny, but because your body needs to release what it has been carrying, and that is the shape it takes. He lay back and looked at the ceiling and thought, something is different now. He was right. What Evelyn had not said to anyone in that restaurant, not to James, not to Lauren, not to Carl as he walked to his car, was that she had not arrived at Carver's Grill on Friday evening simply as a customer. She had arrived as the owner. 6 weeks earlier, acting through a property management firm that carried no name anyone would associate with her, Evelyn had acquired controlling interest in the building that housed Carver's Grill and 2 adjacent commercial spaces on Millbrook Avenue. The acquisition had been quiet, processed through an escrow office on an unremarkable Tuesday morning with no announcement. Brentwood Dining Partners had been notified of the ownership change, but the notice had not been elevated to the people who made decisions, which explained why those people were still taking Saturday morning calls about a manager they had already let go. She had been planning the restoration of Douglas Petty's corner of Millbrook Avenue for 3 years. The restaurant had always been the centerpiece, but the specific shape of what it would become had not been decided until she walked through that front door on a Friday evening and watched a busboy named Andre Washington say, "Excuse me," to an empty chair. On Tuesday morning, she sat across from Andre at the table near the window where the light was right, and she told him what she intended. A training and employment center for young people without clear paths forward and for veterans navigating the particular difficulty of civilian life after service. The restaurant would remain a working kitchen, real service, real standards, but it would also be a classroom, a mentorship space, a place where people learned things that mattered and were held to the expectation that they were capable of learning them. She had already spoken to 3 organizations about partnership. She had funding committed. She had a director of operations in mind. What she needed, she told Andre, was a trainee leader, someone who would start at the bottom of the program, genuinely, without shortcuts, and grow into something more. Someone who had already demonstrated in a concrete and observable way that they understood the difference between looking away and looking directly at a thing. She slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a scholarship letter covering 2 years of tuition at the community college across the district. And beneath it, a program outline for the mentorship track she was building, 12 months, structured, demanding, attached to real responsibility. Andre looked at the envelope. He looked at Evelyn. "Why me?" he asked. Not with false modesty. A real question. "Because you already answered that question on Friday night," she said. "I'm just making it official." Several months passed. The dining room of what had been Carver's Grill was brighter now. The same space, but altered in the way places are altered when the intention behind them changes. The pendant lights were the same, but someone had cleaned the fixtures, and the glow was warmer, more deliberate. New paint on the back wall, a deep, steady blue. The tables rearranged, so the room felt less like a production line and more like a place where people were meant to linger. Near the window, the table where light came in right at mid-afternoon had a small vase of cut flowers changed every few days. The name above the door was different. The laminated menus were gone. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and the lunch service had just finished, and the trainees were running the post-service debrief the way they ran it every day, standing in a loose circle near the host stand, going through what had worked and what hadn't, speaking with the specific candor that develops in people who have been held to high standards long enough to stop being defensive about falling short of them. Andre ran the debrief. He was not the same 19-year-old who had stood in a service hallway with a USB drive in his fist trying to decide what kind of person he was going to be. He was barely 20 now, but he carried himself differently, not with arrogance, which had never been his tendency, but with the ease of someone who has discovered they are capable of more than they previously had evidence for. He spoke clearly. He listened when others spoke. He asked questions instead of giving answers when questions were what the moment called for. He was taking his first semester classes in the mornings and running the floor in the afternoons, and the program director, a retired Army logistics officer named Garrett who had worked with Evelyn for 11 years, had told him 2 weeks ago that his trajectory was exceptional. From Garrett, who communicated almost entirely in complete sentences and direct eye contact, exceptional meant something. Lauren worked the floor 3 days a week. She had not transformed dramatically, which was appropriate, because transformation that lasts rarely announces itself. She was quieter than she had been, more attentive. She made mistakes and addressed them without the old reflex of deflection, which was a harder habit to break than it looked. The other trainees knew her history. It was not a secret, given that the footage had been public for months, and her name had been attached within 48 hours of the convoy, and they watch her the way people watch someone who has been given a chance they know the weight of. She had not let them down yet. She had also, finally, put something on the wall of her apartment. A photograph of the table near the window at the restaurant, taken on a morning when the light came through at exactly the right angle. She had taken it herself on a day she had arrived early and stood in the empty dining room and felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was standing in the right place. The community had noticed the change on Millbrook Avenue. The restaurant had become, quietly but genuinely, the kind of place people felt invested in, not only because of what had happened that Saturday morning, though the story had traveled and most people in the neighborhood knew it, but because of what the place did every day for people who needed something concrete and reliable. 3 trainees from the first cohort had already moved into paid positions. One managed the breakfast service. One had started a catering track. One had gone back to finish a degree funded by a scholarship that existed because someone had decided correcting a wrong was more interesting than punishing one. On a Wednesday in late autumn, Evelyn came back. She came the way she always came, quietly, without announcement. The same modest dress, pressed and clean. The same headscarf. The same old leather purse. She came through the front door while the afternoon shift was setting up, and the person who noticed her first was Dana, who had taken a position as floor supervisor 3 months into the program, and who met her at the door with warmth that had become, over time, something genuine. "She's here," Dana said into the dining room. Andre came out of the back. He saw her standing near the door and felt the same thing he had felt the first time she looked at him across a room. The specific quality of being in the presence of someone who is attending to you completely. He crossed the dining room and stopped in front of her, and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke because some things have already been said in the ways that count and don't need repeating. Then he said, "Your table's ready." He led her to the table near the window. The light was coming in at exactly the right angle. He pulled out the chair and she sat down, and he set a real menu in front of her, not laminated. And then he went to the kitchen. He came back himself with a plate. Roasted chicken. The same order she had placed on a Friday evening several months ago, in a different version of this room, when the world inside it had been smaller and meaner, and she had sat alone and chosen dignity over display. He set it in front of her with both hands, carefully, the way you set something down when you understand that the act of setting it down is the point. She looked at the plate. Then she looked at him. "Thank you, Andre," she said. "Thank you for coming back," he said. She picked up her fork. She tasted the food, and something happened to her expression, small, incomplete, the expression of a person who has returned to a place they love and found it better than they left it. She looked out the window at Millbrook Avenue. "You didn't just serve me food," she said quietly. "You served me hope." Andre stood beside the table and had no answer for that, which was fine because it wasn't a question. He stood for a moment and then excused himself, quietly, without ceremony, and went back to the floor where the work that mattered was still going on. At the table near the window, Evelyn ate her meal. The light came through the glass at exactly the right angle. The room around her was full of the particular warmth of a place given back to its purpose. Laughter at corner table, the sound of the kitchen working, someone near the door saying "excuse me" to a chair that didn't need it and meaning it anyway. In the end, power had not arrived to destroy. It had arrived, as it always does when it belongs to the right people, to reveal who is already there and who still had time to become something worth being. When was the last time you saw something wrong and chose silence? And what did that cost someone you'll never meet? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe for more stories that make you think.